Okay, I think in respect for everybody's time, I think we'll go ahead and start. I'm sure there'll be more people joining this bit by bit. My name's Tom Fleischner. I'm the Executive Director of the Natural History Institute, who's hosting this program tonight. And thank you so much for joining us. I know we all, so many of us spend way more time staring at screens than we like. So we appreciate everybody, especially joining us. And it should be a wonderful evening. We're really excited about this. So I just want to say a quick word about the Natural History Institute, and then something about the format tonight, and then it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. So for those, some of you are quite familiar with the Natural History Institute, some less so. We are a sort of mission-driven independent nonprofit organization based in Prescott, Arizona, in the Mogollon Highlands ecoregion. Our mission is to provide leadership and resources for a revitalized practice of natural history that integrates art, science, and humanities to promote the health and well-being of humans and the rest of the natural world. In essence, our work is to try to foster love and understanding of the world around us, and we do that in a whole lot of different ways. We would invite you to check out our website, which we'll be putting up in the chat there, but also it's quite simple. It's naturalhistoryinstitute.org, and you can roam around on there and see what we have going on. There's all sorts of information on there. We also have a YouTube channel that there's links to on there with many of our past programs on there. If you like what we're doing and you're inclined to support us, there's also a tab that makes it easy to do that. Like all nonprofits, especially this year, we really depend on support from our supporters. And basically just welcome to our Natural History Institute community, which certainly spans North America and well beyond as well. So what's going to happen here this evening is that our speaker will make, as soon as I am finished introducing her, Lisa will make some introductory sort of contextual comments about what we're going to see. And then what we're actually going to do is, for her actual presentation, we pre-recorded a video of her giving the talk as a sort of insurance against the uncertainty of internet connectivity in remote locations, such as where Lisa is sitting currently in Southwest Colorado. And once that video is over, we will then be back live on screen and to have an interactive question and answer session. I know we have a lot of expertise in the group here today, and I think we should have a lively conversation. To do that, as I mentioned, the chat function, which is all these functions there's icons down at the bottom of your screen for those of you who are not so Zoom experienced. The chat function will shortly be taken off, but it'll come back on at the end. Excuse me. And however, the Q&A, the question and answer function, which is down on the right side at the bottom of the screen, will be active from now on. And so we would encourage you to, if you have questions or comments, to put them in there. And then when we come back on screen after the presentation itself, I'll sort of be managing that and feeding the questions to Lisa. And if you have a question, and then if you notice somebody else has already asked pretty much the same thing, instead of putting it up again, what you can do is there's a thumbs up little icon that you can click that shows that that's a particularly popular question. We'll do our very best to get to all the questions. We also will be trying to keep this to a reasonable time frame tonight, so we may have to make some tough decisions towards the end. And I mentioned our YouTube channel. This presentation, if you want to revisit it, or if you, I'm sure many of you will have people that you really would like to share it with afterwards, or say, oh, you should have seen this or whatever. It will be on our YouTube channel as of tomorrow, actually. And we'll have that link up on the chat function as well. And finally, before introducing Lisa, I just want to give a shout out to Zora Elunga-Reed, who is our power behind the scenes here, keeping all of the Zoom things running smoothly. And in this postmodern world, Zora is helping us do this from New York City. So Lisa's in Colorado, I'm in Prescott, Arizona, and Zora is in New York. Okay, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce my dear friend and longtime colleague, Lisa Floyd-Hanna. Lisa is a plant ecologist, a very active field researcher, and an educator. We were colleagues for about 25 years in the environmental studies program at Prescott College. Many of those years, Lisa was the chair of the environmental studies program. And now I'm very happy to say Lisa is the science director here at the Natural History Institute. With a great many colleagues, including Bill Rami, David Hanna, Dave Huffman, and many, many other people, because Lisa's a great collaborator. She has spent a lot of time and energy looking at both the historic and contemporary role of fire in ecological communities of the Southwest and Rocky Mountain regions. And much of that work has been in close collaboration with federal land management agencies, Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, and the National Park Service. We're delighted to see many representatives of those agencies on here tonight. And much of this work has been widely published as well. And she has been especially involved for many, many years at the national park just down the road from where she sits right now, Mesa Verde National Park, which will be the subject of her talk tonight. So, Lisa, welcome so much, and thank you for joining us here tonight.
Thank you, Tom. I'm so happy to be here. I'm really honored. And what I'd like to talk about tonight is actually the culmination of several decades of research at Mesa Verde. And I wanted to mention before we even start my many collaborators. I won't mention everyone, but in particular, Dr. Bill Rami, Emeritus Professor from Colorado State University, and Dave Hanna, who is a research associate at the Natural History Institute. The three of us have worked together for years at Mesa Verde, so everything I talk about tonight directly should involve those other two as well. And then I'd also like to mention two incredible resource managers that I've worked with at Mesa Verde National Park. One is George San Miguel, who is now with the Fish and Wildlife Service, who was the resource manager chief at Mesa Verde and facilitated all of our research and got really involved with it over time. And I believe might be a participant here tonight, I hope. And the other is the late, great Marilyn Collier. Marilyn was a resource manager at Mesa Verde her entire career, and I think that spanned about 50 years. So when we came on the scene, she was the one that really taught us the natural history and has been just an invaluable person for this research. So that's really what I wanted to say by way of introduction. I also want to say that you know, fire, and particularly fire in the Southwest, is such a wide topic and is so important to all of us right now. And I want to make clear that this short presentation tonight is not intended to cover the whole spectrum of fire history or post-fire effects. It is really, I'm trying to narrow it to the work that we did at Mesa Verde, and we recently wrote a kind of culminating paper, which is coming out in the Natural Areas Journal this month, which is looking at some of the patterns of post-fire transitions and framing that in climate change. So that's really the subject tonight, although I'm sure we could talk all night about other aspects of fire. So with that, I think we're ready to watch the presentation, Tom. Hi. This evening, what we'd like to talk about is the juxtaposition of fire, climate, and recovery from fire, with the emphasis on what happens after fires in these current climates. There are many models for climate projections, of course, but by almost all the models, we see similar attributes. The climate in the Southwest is becoming increasingly dry and increasingly hot. If you take a look at this graph from one of these models, you see all of these red bars. These are extremely dry years that are being predicted into the next century. One of the major effects of this is that soil moisture is being affected. So we have much less runoff, less storage capacity, and the soil itself is drying off at unprecedented levels. The heat is something that we've all been experiencing. Here in Prescott, for example, you could see an upward trend throughout the last century, and it just keeps getting warmer and warmer. And this kind of thing is reflected globally as well. So how does this relate to fire? Well, we're seeing this play out this year in the Northwest and California. California alone has had over 8,500 wildfires, and they have burned more than 4 million acres. One of the largest wildfires ever recorded in California is shown here. An interesting thing about these California fires is what kind of vegetation is burning. You know, we tend to think of fire and forest fire, and sometimes it isn't forest burning at all. And in fact, that is the case with the Santa Cruz fire, where there's very little forested ecosystem burning, but quite a bit of chaparral, oak montane, and other types of vegetation. And to a fire ecologist, that's a really important piece, like what's burning, because the effect of fire on that vegetation is going to be very different for each type of vegetation. And we call the relationship with fire in the past, it's fire history. So we want to talk about that today as well. Another really interesting question is whether or not the fire is reburning areas that have recently burned. So for example, the Dolan fire in California has reburned several different older burns, and each of those, because of climate change, may have had a novel vegetation type. So it's getting harder to predict what will happen in these habitats. By all accounts, we know that fires in the West are getting larger. Some accounts say they're getting more frequent, and sometimes they're getting to be of a different character. They're getting to be more severe than they were in the fire history for that vegetation types. So for example, my colleagues at NAU have shown that the number of fires is increasing, the areas increasing in forests and woodlands. And one of the most interesting things is that high severity fire is increasing in forests and woodlands. And we'll come back to talking about what high severity means, but obviously this is a very hot fire that burns in very extreme kinds of conditions and takes out all the vegetation. So it's also called stand replacing. So these kinds of patterns then lead to a lot of questions, and I'd like to explore some of those questions tonight. So first of all, how unusual are these fires that we're seeing today? Are they typical of what you might have seen in that vegetation type in their fire history, or are they different? And then how do those patterns vary across different kinds of vegetation? And then what do you compare it to? What is what we call the reference model that would be used to determine whether the fires today are different or unusual? And then finally, my major focus for tonight will be what are the recovery patterns from fires, given that today's climates are becoming extremely dry and extremely hot. And I'd like to explore some of those questions, particularly in the Pinyon-Juniper Woodlands of the Southwest. Most of the work that I will talk about tonight is work that my colleagues and I have done at Mesa Verde National Park in the Four Corners area of southwestern Colorado. Okay, first question then. Is it weird to have these high severity big fires, or is this the norm? In many vegetation types, it's weird. Not so unusual, though, in the old growth Pinyon-Juniper woodlands of Mesa Verde and elsewhere. And what we have shown is that high severity fire is actually what has always occurred there on centuries long intervals. So it takes many centuries to develop these forests, and then they burn in high severity fires. The two species I'll focus on are Pinus edulis and Juniperus osteosperma, but there are other pinions and there are other junipers as well. And as you can see from these pictures, each of these trees has lots of fuel around it. Its very bark is very thin and shaggy. And thin and shaggy bark that goes to the ground, coupled with lots of vegetation in the area, is a recipe for fire to get into the crown and burned as a high severity fire, particularly if it's dry and if there's a lot of wind. So it's not really easy to burn this vegetation type unless you have those right, correct conditions. The old growth forests in Mesa Verde have very high biodiversity. They are high valued ecosystems, for example, with over 200 forbs, 21 grasses, 100 fungi, 180 lichens, and so on, and tens of thousands of different known insects and many more unknown. So very rich, diverse ecosystem. In fact, this species, Astragalus schmollii, that you see on the right here, has just this week been recommended for listing with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and it is found only on 2 mesas of Mesa Verde. Pinions can get really large. These are old, ancient pinions that are upwards of 1,000 years old, living in these very hard ecosystems where you see hardly any other plants, but these old giants. Mesa Verde has extensive old growth on the mesa tops, as you see here on the right. And if you look on the left, back in 1930s, the forests looked pretty much the same. They had a very high density of trees and very old trees as well. Here's some more Mesa Verde. Stepping back for a minute, though, not all ecosystems are made alike, obviously, and ecosystems and forests in particular, other than Pinyon-Juniper, tend to burn in very different ways. So let's think just for a minute about ponderosa pine, a species we're familiar with, and one of the species which has been burning in California. So ponderosa pine tends to have a lot of distance between the ground and the crown, such that surface fires can run through these forests. Those surface fires don't kill the trees. They scar the trees, as you see here. So live trees or stumps can record the scarring from previous fires. A good dendrochronologist can then come in and sample those, take out a piece, sand it, and determine exactly when the surface fires occurred at that point. And a very good dendrochronologist can also tell you what season. So this was 1788 during the dormant season that fire scar occurred. So ponderosa pine and Jeffrey pine and some other species carry this record of surface fires and suggest that high severity fire was not occurring at that area at that time. Mesa Verde, on the other hand, where we have pinyon and juniper, has been exposed to high severity fires such as this fire that began in 1996 in July and burnt up all the trees. So then the question becomes, if you burnt up all the trees in the fires, how do we go back and say what the time was between fires and what character those fires had if all your evidence has kind of burned up? So developing a model of these past fire events is a little trickier in Pinyon-Juniper Woodlands. And what we have done is found old growth areas in Mesa Verde or Dinosaur National Park, or others have done this in Colorado National Monument and parts of Nevada, finding these old growth trees and coring them to get an increment core showing the ages of those trees. So we can see this is very exhausting work. You look at each ring, you can detect all kinds of interesting climatic things in those rings as well, but essentially it tells you how old the tree is. So if we have a cluster of trees that are 500 or 600 years old, that suggests that at that point in the landscape, there hasn't been a stand replacing fire because these trees are not resistant to fire. So that's the logic that we've used in developing the model. Of course, we've also used down logs, historic accounts, many other kinds of data and pulled them all together to suggest what the pattern was on the landscape. So for example, in 1990, Mesa Verde was aged by looking at each of these fires or lack of fires and determining what would be the probable date for that stand to have originated. So this is called a stand origin map. And you can see that there had not been fires for a very long time in the green, and that we had some fires detected as early as 1790 in the northwest parts of Mesa Verde. Using this stand origin map then and the proportion of the area in each color class here, we find that that fire cycle is about 400 years. And what that means is we expect it would take about 400 years to reburn a study area the size of Mesa Verde. Yet, towards the end of the century, as the climate started to get drier and hotter, we started to see lots of these fires. We had a large fire in 1996, a huge fire in 2000, and then smaller fires in 2002 and 2003. And as you can see from these pictures, they were of the high severity stand replacing type, the type that we would expect in Pinyon-Juniper. But they are certainly more frequent than we would expect in Pinyon-Juniper, occurring every few years during the droughts. So we were able to revisit the stand origin map in 2003 and add those fires. And sure enough, we have removed a lot of the old growth Pinyon-Juniper, but the actual estimate for the fire cycle did not really change. Okay, so that was a little trip through fire history, and that is to allow us to look at what the past might have been for Pinyon-Juniper, in this case in Mesa Verde, and use that as a reference. And so that we could say, if that's the past, then what do we have going forward? So let's look now at patterns of recovery. And remember that while these stands developed in wetter centuries, in fact, they included the Little Ice Age, they now are being exposed to very hot droughts. So how is that affecting the recovery pattern? We were able to study fires from 1989, 1996, 2000, 2002, 2003, at a number of points shown here throughout Mesa Verde. We repeated our study of what was returning to those points over the years and are now in a position to kind of summarize all those data. So we have just recently finished a paper called The Effects of Recent Wildfires in Pinyon-Juniper Woodlands of Mesa Verde, and that will be coming out in Natural Areas Journal next month. So I'd like to just look at a few of the highlights from all of those fires. One of the trends that we're seeing is that we are having invasive species in certain forested areas. So musk thistle and cheatgrass have come into the old growth woodlands where native forbs and grasses ought to be returning. So we've seen since about 1999 the influx of these two species. Cheatgrass is particularly problematic. It creates, as you can see, this is 13 years after the 1996 fire, it creates a very solid, fine fuel landscape. So that if lightning is to strike these areas, then they're going to burn, and they're going to burn in a flashy way. If this is in an area where we typically need 400 or more years between fires to develop an old growth Pinyon-Juniper woodland, and we now have cheatgrass with increasing the potential for shorter fire intervals, then it stands to reason it's going to be very difficult for pinyon to return to this habitat. But there are other kinds of Pinyon-Juniper woodlands as well. So the old growth Pinyon-Juniper woodlands are being invaded by fire. By invasives, after fire. But the other types where shrubs predominate in the understory are having a kind of different issue. So in these habitats, the shrubs resprout immediately after fire, immediately during that year. And they tend to be very prolific and vigorous in their sprouting. So what we're seeing here is Douglas fir, but there are other shrubs as well in the foreground. And in many cases, those shrubs are replacing the forests or woodlands that they used to share. And at least for the time being, it looks as if these are going to be shrub fields and not forested systems. Here's one that's 24 years after fire. And while we have lots of biodiversity there, they're mostly in perennial shrubs. And we have not seen any incidents of pinyon or juniper coming into these habitats. So let's look at these two kinds of Pinyon-Juniper woodlands at Mesa Verde. The old growth woodlands, the ones with the big old trees and very few perennial shrubs in the understory, they return with forbs and grasses and few shrubs. But unfortunately, they're the ones that are being invaded by the cheatgrass and other invasive species. However, the shrub-dominated woodlands that were rich in shrubs before, shown here in the gray, come back in grasses and forbs, but are predominant in shrubs. This is not just a phenomenon going on in Mesa Verde. Here in Prescott, for example, our ponderosa pine forests are rich in perennial shrubs in the understory. Our chaparral and pinyon and juniper areas are rich in shrubs. And when we see fires in these two habitats, we are beginning to see shrub fields develop and a decline in the return of ponderosa pine or juniper in this case. So this is kind of a universal phenomenon, and people are starting to call it type conversion. And we can look into a few reasons why this might be happening in Mesa Verde. So in Mesa Verde, then we take old growth woodlands, burn them with a high severity stem replacing fire. What we're getting now is invasive plants and very slow recovery. No conifers, at least in 30 years. But the woodlands that have perennial shrubs shared, again, you burn them in a stem replacing fire, but you end up with rapid recovery to a shrubland. And as we'll see in a moment, a much lower diversity of native species. The old growth woodlands, when I brought them up in the beginning, I said they are really rich in terms of biodiversity. In the seed bank, for example, we were able to pick up 33 different species of forbs. In the shrub-rich woodlands, we could only pick up 7. Another measure is the species richness after fire. So we would get 142 species after fire in the old growth woodlands, but the shrub-rich woodlands would only have about half of that. So we're trading off, in a way, this shrub stability for biodiversity, at least at Mesa Verde. All right, let's think for a moment about conifers. Before our recent droughts, we used to have a lot of germination of pinyon in this case in Mesa Verde, about 1,277 individuals per hectare. Very abruptly, at about 2000, we started to see a decline in the number of seedlings. And this is in burned areas or unburned areas. So this is just a trend in the region, and that is that way fewer seedlings, down to 332, so about a quarter of the seedlings in recent times are establishing. Pinyons have a difficult time establishing under the best of conditions. While they might germinate if there's enough water, and here's a cute little pinyon seedling here, they are very vulnerable to heat and high light intensity. Unlike juniper, they need to have a nurse plant. So in this case, it's bitterbrush, one of their favored nurse plants, but you'll see pinyon successfully establishing in these perennial shrubs or under logs, but other protected habitats. Another favored habitat for germination of pinyons is the microbial crust, so common in the West. Here we have nitrogen-rich microbes contributing to these wonderfully crusty habitats with great microsites for pinyon to germinate. And that, coupled with some kind of shade nurse plant, is the ideal habitat for pinyon germination. But as we see, those are very vulnerable to fire. So the crust just burn off in high severity fire, and there's no nitrogen fixation detected for a long time. And then we begin to see the buildup of the crust again in about 12 years at Mesa Verde. Okay, so if we take a step back then and look at the landscape at Mesa Verde, with all these trends going on, what kind of post-fire change are we seeing in the areas of the old growth woodlands of Mesa Verde, these high valued systems? So if we look at our vegetation map in 1994, the black is the old growth woodland in Mesa Verde. After the fires and some other natural disasters such as beetles that are also related to climate, we see a decline of we've lost about a third of the old growth woodlands. And we don't expect, because of the trends that we're seeing, to have those recover. Some of the other threats, we've talked about the conifer recovery after fires being a threat to Pinyon-Juniper woodlands. We're also losing a lot of the older mature trees, which produce most of the cones, to Ips confucius beetles. We had a big beetle infestation between 2003 and 2005, where I would say half of the mature trees were killed. The largest trees were the most susceptible. And now we're seeing a second wave of that, unfortunately, in the Four Corners area. This is the beetle in question. There's also a very interesting trend that has been reported in the literature just recently and is visible on the landscape, and that's a dieback of junipers. And those junipers seem to be dying not from a beetle or any biotic thing, but from abiotic causes. And the researchers have attributed that mostly to hydraulic conditions because of the droughts. So in summary, is this something that we're just expecting to see at Mesa Verde, or is this a pattern that we can project to other areas? We have tried to project onto the Colorado Plateau these trends that we've been seeing. So the pinyon juniper in the future, this is one vision, could actually have winners, losers, and some kinds of woodlands that may be kind of neutral. The losers are definitely shown here in the brown. Those are the old growth, what we would have called persistent Pinyon-Juniper woodlands that grow to these 1,000 years and have this high, rich biodiversity of what I was describing for Mesa Verde. Neutral, these are habitats that may experience some loss of the adult pinyons or junipers, but will still have the same pinyon-juniper character. And gains, is actually at higher elevations and on this northern edge, we might actually see some gains in pinyon-juniper in these cooler areas. But overall, we expect that the high-valued old growth pinyon-juniper will be lost in the next century across much of the landscape. In fact, Scientific American had just published a news piece about the Santa Fe area, and they said it's entitled something like, "Should we say goodbye to our Pinyon-Juniper woodlands?" So for those of us who love the Pinyon-Juniper woodland, this is a very sad moment. However, we value the other types of Pinyon-Juniper woodlands as well. And it could be that those shrub-rich systems will create stability on the landscape going forward. All right, thank you for listening. And now we can have some questions.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
Back on. Okay.
We're back on. I want to, we've got some good questions coming up here, and I wanted to just reiterate for everyone, especially because some have joined us, I think, since we started. We invite you, if you have questions for Lisa, you can bring them on board by clicking on the little Q&A icon in the lower right of your screen, and then type in the question, and I'll be then sort of feeding those to Lisa. So, and we have several already. The Laura Fertig says there are millions of acres of pinyon juniper treatments on public lands going on right now. How should your research inform prescribed burns? Should old growth PJ be exempt from treatments?
Yes. This is the big question, right? I mean, that we grapple with, and certainly you, Laura, on a day-to-day basis with BLM have to deal with. I mean, it depends on your objective, obviously. I mean, at Mesa Verde, for example, prescribed burning has been an important part of resource management close to buildings, close to roads. But if the goal is preservation of the heterogeneity of Pinyon-Juniper woodlands on the landscape, which I think is a very important goal, then the use of prescribed burning does not have much of a historical context, right? Because prescribed burning emulates a surface fire kind of regime. So not to be, stepping into the political part. And I know that there are just so many different kinds of objectives that you, Laura, and others in resource management need to meet. But if there is an ecological objective, then prescribed burning would not have an ecological meaning to me in those old growth pinyon juniper woodlands. If the objective is to reduce juniper and increase grassland or increase shrub in a given area or allotment, say if it's on BLM, then indeed prescribed burning might be an effective thing to do. So I guess as usual, it depends. But my own opinion about the old growth pinyon juniper is that it is something that is very threatened, and we should not add to those threats by management activity.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. And thanks for the question, Laura. So we have sort of a pair of things here from Frank Croft. He said, concerning fires getting larger and more frequent, isn't that a result, and this came in fairly early in your talk, isn't that a result of the lack of regular burning and more dense understory, as a result creating more fire ladders and crown fires? And then Truman commented on that and said that is the model for ponderosa pine stands, but not apparently for pinyon juniper. So anything you want to add to that? Or
so I love Truman's response. I mean, I started this by saying there are so many different kinds of forests and woodlands, and there's also so much heterogeneity within the pinyon. So of course the model of emulating surface fires in regimes like ponderosa pine is an excellent model, and to use in those systems where frequent fire would have thinned the thick barked trees, taken out the small ones, taken out the ladder fuels, and allowed for exactly what we see in ponderosa pine, where that kind of management has been very effective. I would say that is not the case in these older pinyon junipers, because as you saw in some of my first pictures, the character of the forest is that there is fuel from the surface right up to the crown, and that's how junipers look. That's how pinyons look. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to think that there was ever a surface fire in there cleaning things up. It's that would be a different kind of an ecosystem. Now, that said, there has been some very nice work in northern New Mexico where the pinyon juniper savanna type may indeed have had a more frequent fire regime. And I could refer you to some of that work later or through, I don't know how we do this, Tom. This is the first time I've done one of these.
If you have follow-up questions for Lisa, you can email us at info@naturalhistoryinstitute.org, and we'll get those questions to her.
So the researcher, it's Ellis Margolis's work, and it's excellent work. And he actually had fire scars on the trees. At Mesa Verde, Dinosaur, anywhere that I've worked, there are no fire scars. You can look for fire scars all day long, and the trees don't experience that kind of surface fire to be scarred and survive. But they do in some pinyon juniper systems, or on the edges of some woodlands. So I'm not saying that is never the context. So I want to be really clear that what I'm talking about is these older stands, these old growth, what we have called in the past persistent woodlands. We may have to rethink that name, persistent woodlands, because they're the least persistent in this drought and hot landscape. I hope that answers that question.
Great. We have a lot of great questions lined up here, a number of which are about sort of related management questions. So Allison Jones, hey Allison, asks, how often do you think the BLM might mischaracterize pinyon juniper stands as, quote, encroaching as opposed to persistent woodlands, and targets them for treatment when perhaps they shouldn't?
That's a hard question to answer because times are changing, and there has been, if you had asked me that question 20 years ago, I would have said most of the time they're mischaracterized. All pinions have been viewed the same, but I've spent a lot of my time working with managers. I think managers have become so much more interested in research, and the research has become available to see that there are different types of woodlands and to be able to manage them in different ways. Now, most of my work is with the Park Service, but I have worked a lot with BLM and the Forest Service, and I guess I am very encouraged that people are seeing that in some cases, fire or other types of management, thinning in particular, are valuable, and sometimes they're not. And they will indeed change the character of the woodland. So for example, if manager deems that it's really important to do thinning for a lot of reasons, I'm sure that there are some very good reasons to do it in some places, that does disturb the soil. That soil today becomes very vulnerable to invasive species, especially if the crusts are broken up. And the worst invasive species, as we showed you at Mesa Verde, is cheatgrass. So once you get cheatgrass in there, you have a fine fuel on the surface. It's a very different fire regime. It's hard to imagine that won't burn as a flashy fuel. And indeed at Mesa Verde, we've seen reburns of some of those areas that might never have burned 30 years ago had they not had cheatgrass in them. So I'm not sure I answered that question. What was exactly the question again, Tom?
How often do you think BLM or presumably anybody else mischaracterizes PJ stands as encroaching as opposed to persistent woodlands, and thus targets them for treatment when perhaps they shouldn't?
Yeah.
I think you.
But, and there was really, I think, a really great paper that Bill Rami, my colleague who I mentioned in the beginning, spearheaded in 2009. He brought together people who are interested in pinyon from all over the place. We all sat down in one room and tried to characterize when certain management strategies might be useful by starting with what are the types of pinyon juniper that are out there, and kind of separated the savanna type from the shrub type, from the persistent type, and then tried to look at management. And that paper has been downloaded, read, cited by so many managers. I can only think that has become something that people are really thinking about, is how to correctly manage the particular kind of pinyon juniper that they have in their landscape.
Great, thank you. And we have about 9 or 10 more questions here, so we'll try to get through these, and then that may be most of our time. So speaking of good managers, we have a question from Dale here in the Prescott National Forest. He asks, what are your concerns about management where juniper in particular is invasive versus persistent?
Dale, I guess you're thinking about on the Prescott, where are you talking about? I want to get a little clarity on your question if I could, because the Prescott forest is different in that it has Juniperus depiana, which is a sprouter. So Juniperus depiana is different from
That's
the
alligator juniper.
I'm sorry, yeah, alligator juniper.
Just for yeah.
Dale knows that. But so that acts like a shrub, you know. So is that the kind of juniper you're talking about, or are you talking about the Pinyon-Juniper chaparral ecotone on the, say, the north part of Prescott, you know, out in Chino and all? Then that would be a different answer. Did we get any clarity there from Dale?
Well, the way the system is set up, it's a little hard. There might be a little time lag before, if Dale wants to follow up. Oh, here he is. He says it makes sense. He was thinking of the latter near Chino. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So so that's osteosperma and other shaggy kinds of junipers. So there, my sense, you got to be a little careful about this, is that if one uses prescribed burning there, that will kill the junipers, which would be in line, I think, with the objective, which is to increase forage and decrease water consuming capacity of conifers. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that, because looking at the historic work done by many people, not myself, but Harley Shaw in particular and others, that showed historic photos that it was much more of a juniper dominated area in the last 150 years. So I think it's as the objectives change, then the efficacy of using fire changes. So that's kind of a politically charged question in a way, and one that I'd love to explore in more detail with you sometime, Dale, but maybe not right here.
Great, thank you. And thanks, Dale. Next question is from Jeff Shalau. Hello, Jeff. Jeff asks if you have any information about the use of fire by indigenous people, because he's seen presentations describing that in California. Mm-hmm.
There's, yeah, Jeff, of course, there's been lots of incredibly varied use of pinyon-juniper forests that involved fire throughout history, and every indigenous culture probably had their own way of using fire. One of the neat things about Mesa Verde is that there's been a really clear study done by researchers at NAU that dug cores in several of the shallow lakes at Mesa Verde, the ephemeral lakes in Prater Canyon, and they were able to show the use of fire over time. And so by tying that in with the influx of the ancestral Pueblans or Anasazi to that area. So there we do know that fire was very infrequent until the ancestral Pueblans came in about 200 AD. The frequency of fire, as evidenced by charcoal in those cores, went up dramatically and then dropped again in the time frame of our studies. So it went back to about a 400-year cycle. So their study, while much longer, going much deeper in time, is consistent with smaller frequent fires by indigenous populations. And then once the landscape returned to more of a human-free environment, I guess you would call it, and even prior to being a national park, fires were much more infrequent.
Okay, thanks. Next, from our colleague, Dave Huffman, thanks you, and says, concerning historical patterns, are there other recent changes in fire patterns or recovery? For example, although stand replacing fire is, quote, normal in PJ woodlands, are fire sizes or high severity patch sizes increasing due to climate? And of course, are there management options to mitigate climate related changes?
Hi, Dave. And that's a big loaded question. Yeah, I mean, there are definitely, there's definitely at Mesa Verde, try to answer that for Mesa Verde. There is some evidence that the fires are pretty much larger, except for one big spate of fire that occurred in the 1700s. So there, it's not really clear, but that 2000 fire was more, to me, more impactful because it took out so much of the old growth Pinyon-Juniper woodland. In fact, it took out a third of it from Mesa Verde Park. And fortunately, the mesa itself to the south of the park, on Ute tribal land, and some BLM land, was not as severely affected. I think mitigating stand replacing fire is a tough thing to do. Actually, this is more your field than mine, how to mitigate those, yet keep the character of Pinyon-Juniper woodland is a real struggle, right? Because the character is high diversity, high fuel, kind of that kind of complex fuel system. And if that's what you value, then mitigating it kind of takes that away, but might take away the fire and the high severity fire potential, and mean that those woodlands might persist for a while. So what has happened at Mesa Verde is the fire management plan has consistently had a policy of full suppression so that some of those stands can be preserved in kind of a museum kind of quality. Mesa Verde has mesas that have sandstone rims on a lot of them. So a lot of the fire wouldn't pass if it started in the canyon, for example, wouldn't pass onto the mesa top. So there has been some effort to thin right at that edge adjacent to the sandstone. And I don't know if that has helped at this point to preserve the old growth Pinyon-Juniper.
Thank you. And thanks, Dave. Truman asks, oops, I just hopped the wrong. Why was the historical fire interval so long for Mesa Verde Pinyon-Juniper? Limited by ignitions, tree fuel, understory fuel, grass, very rare dry periods. So why so long?
Okay, certainly not ignitions. So for example, there can be during the monsoons at Mesa Verde, there can be 17 to 18 on the average small ignitions a day in July, right? And most of those would burn a few trees, or maybe a small little patch of trees. The understory is not very dense in these old growth woodlands. There's it's less likely the fire will burn on the surface. It is much more likely to burn crown to crown, which are touching, if the winds are high enough. So the climate, the fact that the fuels were wet, and the winds had to be very, very high in order to get crown fires to actually go. And then when they go, they go. Yeah.
Great. Next question. Asks, as far as the Mesa Verde, the fires that you referred to in the early 2000s, 2002, 2003, etc., were they reburned areas, or were those newly burned areas, like areas burning for the first time?
Mm-hmm. Both. So Many of them burnt. There's 2,000 fires. One was on the east side of the park and one was on the west side of the park. The one on the west side burned almost entirely new areas. So all old growth pinyon juniper, and a little into the 1972 fire and just the tip of the 1989 fire. But the fire on the other side of the park, the largest fire, the Bircher fire, burned, completely reburned. The 1959 fire, the 1972 fire was almost totally reburned. No, only partially reburned. And many of the fires that we had reconstructed in the past were reburned. So both historical fires from the historic record and reconstructed fires were reburned.
Great. Question here from Apple Snyder, asking about citizen science. I may have something to add to this as well. She says, are there citizen science projects or platforms that you would recommend to engage the public in efforts to learn about and monitor PJ woodlands associated plants and animals?
I think it's the best idea I've ever heard, right? I think we should be involving the public, citizen science in every kind of project. We're certainly thinking a lot about that on the Prescott Forest, where people are very, very interested and have access to the forest and are very, very involved. In national parks, you know, there are, like Mesa Verde, I think there are limits to the kind of citizen science you could do. And one of the things about Mesa Verde National Park is it's archaeologically, of course, one of the most, it's a World Heritage Site. That's why the park was started in 1906. So there are necessary regulations for people being out in the backcountry. So there, maybe not, but certainly in other Pinyon-Juniper woodlands, yes, I think there should be more platforms, and I bet there are that I'm just not tapping into right now mentally.
I'll just jump in and add a little bit that one of the standard kind of platforms for gathering citizen science data just generally is iNaturalist, which is a free app. And we here at the Natural History Institute are about to be kind of launching some projects and sort of helping coordinate some projects with that. So we'd encourage you with that. And for a similar thing for if you're interested particularly in birds, is eBird is a really great thing, and that really it's ways of keeping track of your own records, but in the process adding to immense databases that are proving very, very useful. Okay, so thank you. So we've got 4 more questions, and I think we'll probably be about out of time at that, so we'll wrap it up after that. So the next question is, does the sad future awaiting old growth PJ have management implications to the obliteration by chaining of PJ to create forage?
I think so. I think that if there are identified old growth Pinyon-Juniper woodlands, that they should have more of a protective status than one for forage. So certainly areas, some of the most fabulous old growth Pinyon-Juniper woodland is in northern Colorado, the Colorado National Monument and surrounding areas, and Dinosaur National Monument. And those are, and particularly at Dinosaur, they do struggle to try to balance those two things, but we have identified the old growth areas and the fire history there. And I believe that is being used to avoid those areas for other resource goals like forage production.
Okay. Next question from Carol. She asks if are any of the animals and birds bouncing back from these massive fires? Do we know anything about recovery of vertebrates?
Yeah, there have been some very good studies. Neil Cobb has NAU has done some work at Mesa Verde, looking at recovery of animals, and there's been some work with ants at Mesa Verde, and with birds. And so I'm not, I don't think I should try to say exactly who's coming back and who isn't. It definitely depends on the habitat, but I will.
Oops.
The troublesome things, pinyon jay, and that may not have that much to do with fire, but certainly has to do with all the habitats of Pinyon-Juniper in the Southwest. So there's been a real decline in pinyon jays, and pinyon jays are the major vector for planting pinyon seeds. So they have this cool sublingual pouch where they pack all kinds of seeds in there. Their entire reproduction is cued into the presence of cones, green cones on pinyon. It affects their gonadal development. And then they go out, they migrate and they go out and plant all these seeds in the perfect germinable habitats. So that symbiosis between pinyon jays and pinyon recovery is something that's really, really important right now. And it has been said by the researchers who are looking at the pinyon decline in New Mexico that they require the old growth. And so I think that's one thing certainly to keep our eye on, and that particular bird is not making any kind of recovery. In fact, it's in decline.
Thank you. Oops, things just flopped around here.
I'm glad you're doing that part.
Well, George just had a response, but then it flipped
in. I was going to say, George San Miguel is on here.
Here it goes. George says, mostly open country vertebrate animal species replace the forest species after a stand replacing fire. So thank you, George.
Thanks, George.
Okay, we have just a couple more, and then I think we're going to have to call it good. Mark Bellis lives in Flagstaff and said he's surprised that we don't have California type large fires here yet. What are the differences that we haven't seen them? And then he makes a joke, can't we just rake more? Speaking of management decisions.
Yeah, let's definitely rake more. I think that we've been lucky. But honestly, this was a good year. But last year, most of Arizona experienced very huge California-like fires. So I think that, and Colorado has had the largest fire in history of Colorado since records have been kept. So it hasn't been like we've really been avoiding fires. Northern New Mexico has been lucky. Southwest Colorado was lucky this year as well. And I think we just didn't get the number of ignitions and climatic patterns, but I'm not really I don't follow the models like that to speak to that, but it's not that we have missed fires. I mean, we've had some very big ones, but of course those are in different vegetation types, not Pinyon-Juniper this year.
Yeah. Great. And I think our final question is from Mary O'Brien. Hey, Mary. Who says that we're seeing in southeastern Utah, they're seeing dense growth of young pinyon amongst older juniper, along with drought mortality of some pinyon and beetle attacks on some of the pinyon. And so the current effort has been to remove much of the young pinyon for, quote, forage for deer and elk, unquote. What is going on here?
I'm at a loss, actually, to answer that question. You said this is southeastern Utah. Was that the question?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So just west of you, just west of Mesa Verde.
Mm-hmm. So we're still talking about Pinus edulis, because Pinus monophila has some different attributes in other parts of Utah. So there's an increase in seedlings. That's news to me. And so that is unusual. It has always been true that pinyon and juniper are great nurse plants for each other. In fact, other than the bitter brush that I showed you in that picture, juniper is a favored nurse plant of pinyon, and pinyon is a favored nurse plant of juniper. I mean, those trends have always been there. So I'm not too surprised to hear that if there is some effective germination of pinyon, that it's happening under junipers. But I'm just surprised to hear that there's a lot of germination at all. And I'm kind of excited about that. And maybe we could follow up. Maybe you could email me and we could talk about that a little more. I'd like to go out to where that is, because I've been hearing from other people in the Toady Springs area, for example, Cane Gulch and all, that there hasn't been any reproduction. So I'm curious.
That's great. So Mary, if you want to get in touch with me, I can pass that on and hook you guys up. Okay, well, I think we kind of need to wrap it up. Oh, actually, one last question here. Truman asked if local Native Americans around Mesa Verde still collect pinyon nuts.
Yes. Every time there's a masting year, which now masting years only occur on about a 5 to 7 year interval. So in a given area, all the trees will mast together, and then you see lots of people coming up. Navajo in particular will collect lots of seed and roast them and sell them. It's a kind of a nice ephemeral economy, I think. But yeah, people love pinyon nuts and love to use them. So
great. So, and thank you, Dale, for your comment there. Appreciate that. Lisa, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us here this evening. And thank you so much to everyone who, for all your great questions and attention here tonight. Just a couple of comments in closing. One is I just wanted to, again, invite you all to feel a part of our community of the Natural History Institute. And one way to jump into that is to visit our website, naturalhistoryinstitute.org. If you have not yet done that, there's all sorts of great stuff on there, including a link to our YouTube channel, where this talk will be as of tomorrow. And a great many of our previous programs are on there, a lot of great stuff, and also including, I wanted to mention, a really exciting new series that our program director, Bob Ellis, has been creating this summer called Notes from the Field, which are short educational videos, usually about in the 5 to 10 minute range. And those about all sorts of great topics, including one with Lisa in the field looking at a fire recovery here near Prescott, Arizona. And also, when you're on the website, if you're not already on our mail list and you'd like to be, please, there's an easy way to sign up. And then we don't share that with anybody, and we you'll just hear about all of our great program opportunities. So with that, I want to again thank Lisa and wish everybody very great holidays. Please stay safe. And enjoy the love of the world that we're all working to preserve together. Okay, so thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.